You've heard of the Disney Vault. This is the Disney bookshelf, and I'm reading my way through it. Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Miss Evalyn, and if you tuned into the previous installment of this series, you know that I am a huge Disney fan and a big adaptation nerd. And so I have taken on the task of reading every single piece of text I can get my hands on that was adapted into a Disney film. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on films from the wartime era. The wartime era, as the name suggests, refers to films produced by Walt Disney Animation Studios during and directly after World War II. Now, the war had already begun to affect the studio by the end of the golden era. Walt Disney himself blamed it for why Bambi didn't do so well worldwide. But by 1943, it had caused some real changes in the operation of the studio. Many of the young men who were working at the studio were drafted into the war effort, budgets shrank, and the studio actually shifted to creating propaganda films. This is the time period when Donald Duck got drafted into the Navy. Despite all of this, the studio still managed to produce 7 feature-length animated films during this time period, and we'll be discussing 4 of those in this video. Unfortunately, we won't be discussing the Three Caballeros or Saludos Amigos. So let's talk about the films we are going to be discussing. 1946's Make Mine Music, 1947's Fun and Fancy Free, 1948's Melody Time, and 1949's The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. These are all what we call package films. They're feature-length animations made up of a collection of shorts. That means some of them incorporate multiple texts. So we actually have more than 4 things on our reading list for this video, but first we have Casey at the Bat. Casey at the Bat, Ballad of a Nation, is a poem by Ernest Thayer, originally published in 1888 in the San Francisco Examiner. It was popularized by DeWolf Hopper, a vaudeville actor who used to perform the poem in his shows as he traveled around the country. The poem had originally been published anonymously under the pen name Finn, and as it gained popularity, people wanted to know who the author of the piece was. And it wasn't until several other writers came forward attempting to claim the poem that Thayer himself claimed it publicly. At that point, there had been so many claims to authorship that in 1908, Dr. Harry Peck, a professor of Latin at Columbia University, launched a full investigation into the true authorship of the poem and determined that it was indeed written by Thayer. The poem tells the story of a fictional baseball player, and similar to the controversy surrounding its author, there was a lot of speculation about who that character may have been modeled after, and several real-life baseball players tried to claim that they were the inspiration for Casey. In his article, The Mighty Casey, Enduring Folk Hero of Failure, F. Scott Regan writes, Thayer, however, insisted the poem has no basis in fact, and the name derived from a boyhood bully with the same name. I evolved Casey from the situation I had seen so often in baseball, a crack batsman coming to the bat with the bases filled and then fallen down. Apparently back in the day it was very popular for children to memorize and recite the poem. I'm not going to do that, but I will read it out loud. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but 1 inning more to play. And then, when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to that hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could get but a whack at that, we'd put up even more money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a Lulu and the latter was a cake, so upon that stricken multitude grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, toward the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and the men saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe at second and Flynn a huggin' third. Then from 5,000 throats and more there rose a lusty yell. It rumbled through the valley, it rattled in the dell, it knocked upon the mountain and recoiled up the flat, for Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was an ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was a pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by, the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. That ain't my style, said Casey. Strike one, the umpire said. From the benches black with people there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. Kill him! Kill the umpire! Shouted someone on the stand. And it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult, he bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew, but Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, Strike two! Fraud! Cried the maddened thousands, and echo answered fraud. But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold, they saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip, his teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. All right, that is Casey at the Bat, which I imagine probably hit a lot harder. At the turn of the century, when baseball was the American pastime, Reagan points out in his article, there is no indication in Thayer's poem that this is the final game of the year, that Casey will never return to hit a home run. Baseball will return, and the home team will win again, and the shadow on this typical American town will change to sunshine and laughing children soon enough. American optimism remains supreme in this self-proclaimed ballad of the Republic. So it makes sense for Disney as a company to approach this text. Yes, they do adapt a lot of European fairy tales, but Walt Disney loved him some Americana. He was obsessed with Abraham Lincoln. You walk into Disneyland, what's the first thing you see even before the castle? Main Street, USA, baby. Hi, Editing Evalyn here to point out that this short actually ties in so well to the Americana theme of Main Street, USA that at both Walt Disney World and Disneyland Paris, on Main Street, there's a hot dog restaurant called Casey's Corner that's themed to Casey at the Bat. He loved him some traditional American family values, and I assumed some baseball as well. So unsurprising that this was picked for adaptation into a short, and it was incorporated into the first of our films, 1946's Make Mine Music. In the article Make Mine Pop Music, Walt Disney Films and American Popular Music 1940 to 1955, J.B. Kaufman discusses this sort of interlude in the studio history that aligns with this wartime era, where the Disney production company began to align itself with Tin Pan Alley songwriters. So for the first 15 or so years of the studio, music is incredibly important to the work that they're doing, but Walt and Roy quickly discovered that it was far more cost-effective to score a cartoon with original music than to pay royalties to a music publisher for an existing number. So they had in-house songwriters like Frank Churchill and Lee Harlan, who generated songs for the studio that ended up being hits in their own right. But as we move into the 1940s, there's a shift, and Disney starts to bring in outside songwriters, sometimes to collaborate with their in-house guys, but sometimes to just completely score a piece on their own. As early as 1940, they were in talks to produce a film featuring the music of Benny Goodman. And writer Jim Brodero brought the idea of a swing fantasia to Walt. And that project was tentatively titled Swing Street, and would eventually be developed into Make Mine Music, which does feature 2 songs performed by Benny Goodman. It also includes the voices of several other top talents of the day: Dinah Shore, the Andrews Sisters, Andy Russell, Nelson Eddy. And Kaufman writes, all these guest stars needed songs to sing, and some of the songs were provided by songwriters who were likewise guests. And this interlude, as Kaufman calls it, actually extends into the next era of Disney animation we'll be discussing, the Silver Age. What? Oh no. Okay, so apparently as of 2024, Make My Music is the only Walt Disney Animation Studios feature film that is not available on Disney+. That is so rude. Disney, what the heck? You know, I swear I've seen this film before. Maybe I've only seen the Peter and the Wolf part. That's so weird. Apparently they just don't release this one for undetermined reasons. But I found the section we need to talk about. I was gonna commit to watching the whole thing of all of these because there aren't that many in this video, but okay. Just gonna watch the Casey section.
Oh, what a lark to ride out to the park and just to see Casey.
There's a song at the beginning of this that is not utilizing the poem at all. It's just inspired by the poem. It's also kind of sexist. The ladies don't understand baseball a bit. But when they see Casey,
when he goes to bat, hang on to your hat.
he's prancing, goodness.
Kill him! Kill the umpire!
Yell the cutie from the stand.
So she had the means and the motive. Well, that was the thing that I watched. Okay. This vlog is just stumbling block after stumbling block. The next film we'll be exploring is 1947's Fun and Fancy Free. Unlike Fantasia and Make Mine Music, which consist of a series of shorts, Fun and Fancy Free actually only has 2 featurette-length segments that are framed by a live-action narrative. And both of these featurettes happen to be adaptations. The first is Bongo, which was inspired by the short story Little Bear Bongo by Sinclair Lewis. This is a children's story originally published in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1930. It's about a young bear who's trained to do acrobatics. I cannot for the life of me find the original story. The only versions of this that I can find are versions that were released by the Walt Disney Company after the film came out. And that's just the wrong kind of adaptation for this video. We are trying to read the original texts that were adapted into film, and this is a text that was adapted from the film. So I fear I must admit defeat. For the first time in this series, we will not be talking about one of the texts. We will be talking about the other one, because the second featurette in Fun and Fancy Free is Mickey and the Beanstalk, which is obviously inspired by the Jack and the Beanstalk fairy tale. And man, if I don't have the opposite problem with that, I can find too many versions of Jack and the Beanstalk because of its history as both an oral and literary fairy tale. In her article, The Composition of Jack and the Beanstalk, Christine Goldberg writes, folklorists dutifully refer Jack and the Beanstalk to AT-328. Remember, that's the Arne Thompson tale type. The boy steals the giant's treasures, a designation for a tale that also features a series of, usually, 3 thefts from a giant. However, the defining image of Jack and the Beanstalk itself, does not belong to other versions of AT-328. And in fact, it seems like early versions of this tale do not include that 3 thefts framework, but do include the Beanstalk. So it seems as if this tale was perhaps created by the merging of 2 different oral traditions over time. The very earliest published version of what would eventually become the tale that we're familiar with is The Story of Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean, which was published by J. Roberts in 1734. But the tale even predates that publication orally. And it's not until a chapbook that's published in 1806 that we get Jack and the Beanstalk as we're sort of familiar with it, where he goes up and down multiple times, stealing items from the giant. And then the probably most well-known version is Joseph Jacobs' version. So Joseph Jacobs is another folklorist and collector of tales, best known for his publications of English fairy tales. English fairy tales in 1890 and more English fairy tales in 1893. Alongside Jack and the Beanstalk, he collected stories like Goldilocks and The Three Little Pigs and Tom Thumb. It's possible to delve even further into Jack as a fairy tale stock character. He appears across a lot of tales from actually a lot of different cultures that have all sort of developed, I believe, out of this like British tradition. In Southern Appalachian folklore, there's a cycle of Jack tales. These stories traveled to America with immigrants from Scotland and Ireland and seem to have developed over time into their own distinct tradition. And we were just talking about how much Walt Disney loved Americana. So that begs the question, why wouldn't he adapt the uniquely American version of this tale? How was he defining American culture to himself that excluded this group of people? All right, it's time for us to return to Maria Tatar's classic fairy tales. We're going to be reading the Joseph Jacobs version of Jack and the Beanstalk. But first, the introduction. Let's see if I can pick out any more interesting details for you. All right, she's talking about the Tabor version of the tale, the 1807 version, and how he wrote a very moralistic version of the tale. And when Joseph Jacobs began compiling stories for his anthology, English Fairy Tales, he dismissed Tabor's History of Jack and the Beanstalk as very poor and reconstructed the version he recalled from childhood, drawing on the memory of a tale told by his childhood nursemaid in Australia around 1860. The British folklorist Catherine Briggs has referred to Jacobs' version as the original, but it is in fact simply one of many efforts to recapture the spirit of the oral versions in widespread circulation during the 19th century. So the biggest difference thus far to this and other versions I'm familiar with, including the Mickey Mouse one we're about to watch, is that it's an ogre, not a giant, that he's encountering. Everything else, like the fee-fi-fo-fum, that's all in there. It just happens to be an ogre instead of a giant. I don't know, maybe at the time giants weren't as big of a deal. Oh, that's so funny. Then the ogre fell down and broke his crown, and the beanstalk came toppling after. Apparently, this dude on the front is the ogre. Okay. Now it's time to watch Mickey Mouse do the same thing. In a nod to the fact that Bongo is technically an adaptation, even though we aren't talking about it, I will watch this whole movie. Even though I think the puppets are creepy. And clearly the Mickey and the Beanstalk portion is the one that has stayed in the cultural memory more. Again, you could tell by the fact that it is the cover for Fun and Fancy Free, but also it has been incorporated into the parks. This also is the return of Jiminy Cricket for reasons. This is so funny that in the credits it's featuring Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, Jiminy Cricket. Oh, also the ventriloquist dummies are there, but not Goofy, who is also in this.
Don't cross a bridge or peek round the corner until you're there. Just learn to smile, and in a while you'll find truffles a bubble of air.
Oh, poor Bongo. She said it at the same time as me. That's so funny.
Poor Bongo.
Do you think Bongo and Dumbo know each other? They're both circus stars. Maybe they're rivals. There's a whole Golden Harp backstory in this that is their way of getting around the theft issue, I think.
One day a mysterious shadow crept over the valley, and then something dreadful happened.
So similar to the Tabbert version, in which Jack is stealing back wealth that was stolen from his father, Mickey is stealing back the golden harp that kept Happy Valley happy.
3 poor farmers gripped by the pangs of starvation.
It's also no Jack and his mother. It's just Mickey, Donald, and Goofy all living in a house together, starving.
What diabolical thought is being hatched in the fevered brain of this poor, demented duck?
Fee, fi, fo, fum. Apparently, those are magic words that let him change his shape in this version. A figment of your imagination, you say?
Has anybody seen anything of a teensy weensy little mouse?
No,
So we're seeing kind of a theme here in adapting these fairy tales. Disney's sort of stripping away the repetitive traditional fairy tale structure in favor of the movie format. Also the more traditional introduction of the tale with Jack's mother and the selling of the cow in exchange for the beans is tamped down in favor of the Happy Valley story of the harp being stolen. The harp is positioned as a character with her own sentience who plays a role in her own rescue. So instead of just stealing from the giant, Mickey and his friends are rescuing this almost damsel in distress. Unlike some of the other texts we've encountered, neither Little Bear Bongo or the Jack and the Beanstalk story is introduced as a book. Bongo's introduced through a record, and I imagine they probably sold Bongo records after this film was released. And then Edgar Bergen is telling the Mickey and the Beanstalk story from memory. So we're moving a little bit away from the book as framing object for these stories. Although we'll see it appear again in the future. Hi, it's time to talk about Melody Time. And there are actually a couple of texts that are incorporated into this one. Starting with Little Toot. Does anybody else remember this? Unfortunately, the only version I can find is this one that was adapted from the original, because this is an almost 100-year-old picture book by Hardie Gramatky. He was a very prolific watercolor artist. And also, before he became a children's book author, he worked as an animator and picture book artist for Disney. We'll dive more into that relationship a little bit later when I start reading this. We also have Trees by Joyce Kilmer, which is a poem that's part of an anthology that I will be reading digitally, so I don't have a book. And then we'll be reading 1, maybe 2 stories from Mary Pope Osborne's American Tall Tales. The one that I know we'll definitely be reading is Pecos Bill, which is the, I believe, final segment of Melody Time. But there is also, in both the film and the book, the inclusion of Johnny Appleseed. Initially, because Johnny Appleseed is a real person who just became mythologized, I didn't think I wanted to include it, but while we're here, might as well read that as well for a little bit more context. So as I said, the author of Little Toot, Hardie Gramatky, was a watercolor artist. Before he wrote this book, he worked for 6 years at Walt Disney Animation Studios as an animator and illustrator. Little Toot was published in 1939 after several initial rejections from publishers who claimed that children weren't thinking that way. What does that mean? Well, at the time, most books for children were steeped in fantasy, fairy tale. And this book, despite the fact that the boat is anthropomorphized is very much based in the day-to-day. It was inspired by the view of the river from Hardie Gramatky's art studio window. And obviously those initial publishers were dead wrong because the book was an instant success and multiple studios were vying for the movie rights. But because Hardie Gramatky had a pre-existing relationship with Walt Disney, he ended up selling the rights to his company. In fact, in her article, Hardie Gramatky, Just for the Love of Doing, Naomi Ekperigin highlights the impact that Walt Disney had on Gramatky as an artist. In a journal from 1977, one can see that he still remembered Disney's advice even when it wasn't directed toward him. He wrote, "Walt Disney, to Johnny Cannon, whose animation was always so rigid and tight. Put that same fun and play into your work that you put into your playing baseball. You've got to have fun with drawing." This idea pervaded Gramatky's work from the late 1920s onward, and he credits much of the energy and movement in his work to his time spent at Disney. So annoyingly, this is not the original book. This is not the original illustration by Hardie Gramatky. It's adapted from the original text. And you know, at first, I told myself, well, it's almost 100 years old. You can't expect it to still be in circulation widely. But there are books on this list that are well over 100 years old that I had no problem finding. So, picture books. We need to care more about picture books. SOS. See, this one I feel like I read as a kid, but I only have like the barest recollection, and this definitely is not Hardie Gramatky's illustration style. I feel like I remember there being more to this. This seems like a very simplified version of an already simple story. I don't know why they put this out. What was going on in 1993? And see, this is really bumming me out. This is really bumming me out because not only do I remember different illustrations in a longer story, but we're not going to be able to compare and contrast the illustration versus the animation. Big sigh for little Toot. We move on, I guess, to trees. Okay. One shift later, and it's time to read about some trees and other poems. Trees. For Mrs. Henry Mills Alden. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. That's it. That's the whole thing. Shortest poem so far. I shall be interested to see how it was adapted into a whole segment. And with that, we move on to American Tall Tales. King of the Wild Frontier. So, according to Osborne, the Pecos Bill story originates from a series of pieces published in Century Magazine, the first published in 1923 by writer Edward O'Reilly. And he combined inspiration from Western folklore and the tall tale, obviously, genre that this book explores. And then over time, other people began to write about the character as well. Ask any coyote near the Pecos River in western Texas who was the best cowboy who ever lived, and he'll throw back his head and howl, "Ah-woo!" If you didn't know already, that's coyote language for Pecos Bill. Bill turned around to look at his rear end, and for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't have a tail. "Dang," he said. I'm curious, which came first, Pecos Bill, The Jungle Book, or Tarzan? We're gonna look it up. So Pecos Bill originated in 1923. The Jungle Book, predates that, 1894. And Tarzan of the Apes was published in 1912. Which is so interesting because only one of these is considered folkloric, right? It took on this life outside of its original publication as a tall tale. And we consider folklore often to be very, very, very old. But of the 3 texts we'll be reading for this series where a child is adopted by an animal foster family, this is the most contemporary. Although I'm sure inspiration for at least Pecos Bill, raised by coyotes, and Mowgli, raised by wolves, comes from the Romulus and Remus story, which predates all of these. So this version of Pecos Bill had a happy ending. He and Sue end up on the moon together. That is not the version I'm familiar with, and I don't think it's the version that is in the Disney film. So, we shall see. All right, now that we have read all 3 texts, we are ready to watch Melody Time. I'm curious what the cover is going to be on this one. Is Donald Duck in this? Did I forget that Donald Duck is in this? And so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need. The sun, the rain, and an apple seed. Sweet and good to me. I forgot that this song exists.
Little Toot was just a tug, just a happy harbor tug.
Little Toot is bad at his job. This was not in the abridged version. Did he get banished? Oh my goodness.
And as he popped an SOS, he raced to the rescue of a ship nearby.
Come on, Little Toot.
Yes, you're now a great big Toot, little Toot.
That was cute. Trees.
Lovely as a tree.
They simply are just singing it so far. Oh, wait. Taking a break for some classic early Disney. Ooh, wind. How interesting.
Here's a tall tale straight from the chuck wagon. Just the way the old timers used to tell it.
But this is not framed with the book opening the way that Johnny Appleseed was. Because this actually has its roots in publication. I guess Johnny Appleseed also has its roots in newspaper publication, so neither one is really a book.
Pecos Bill? Who's he?
What? Never heard of Pecos Bill? Imagine that.
Why, I thought everybody knows Pecos.
This version does not show how he gets reintegrated into society as like a human. He just picks a career.
He'll become a root tootin' cowboy.
He was the roughest, toughest quitter, never known to be a quitter, 'cause he never had no fear of man or beast. Yippee-ki-yay, yippee-yi-oh. He's the toughest critter west of the Alamo. So I think the reason that there are several of these like American folktale or tall tale stories included in the package films of this era is that they were working on and then ended up scrapping a project that was supposed to be a collection of all of them. They did eventually in 2002 release Disney's American Legends, which does include this Johnny Appleseed short. It doesn't, however, include The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which was also conceived for this scrapped project and would eventually be developed into half of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which is the final film we'll be watching for this video. It's time to read The Wind in the Willows, or rather reread in my case, because I have in fact already read this book. I think this is the first full text that I'm rereading for this series, which is fun. This is one of the ones we read in my Modern British Children's Literature course that I have credited as being part of the inspiration for this video series. And I did genuinely enjoy The Wind in the Willows. And I wanted to learn more, which is why I checked out this annotated edition. It's actually from the same collection of annotated works that my annotated classic fairy tales is from. You're probably going to be seeing several of these annotated editions in the coming videos because they have an annotated Alice in Wonderland, which I already have checked out, and I've just discovered that they have an annotated Hans Christian Andersen, which I really want to get my hands on. That'll be helpful for a couple of videos coming up.
The Reluctant Dragon. Like the Reluctant Dragon?
So one of the films that didn't make the cut for this video because I decided it was not technically an animated feature is 1941's The Reluctant Dragon. It's actually a very interesting piece. It's framed as a tour of Walt Disney Animation Studios, and you get to see the Burbank campus and all of the different departments and things, and then you get to see the short that they're working on, which is The Reluctant Dragon, which is apparently based off of another work by Kenneth Grahme, the author of The Wind in the Willows, which I didn't realize. That's so fun. I've been keeping sort of a mental tally of which authors had multiple works adapted by the studio, and this adds Kenneth Grahme to my list. I think he might be tied with Perrault. That's really interesting. What? I am so intrigued. Every new thing I learn about Kenneth Grahame's marriage fascinates me. It seems as if every other woman in his life, especially his sister Helen, really did not like his wife, Elspeth, and his second biographer described her as someone who fed on the personalities of artistic celebrities and used their genius as a prop for her own lack of creative talent. So not a lot of Elspeth fans out there. And what's doubly interesting is that there are scholars who think that Kenneth Grahme was queer, and he did spend a significant portion of his life living separately from his wife, cohabitating with another man, which raises so many questions about why he married her in the first place. And apparently also we've lost her side of most of their early correspondence. So we have so little information to go off of. I will forever be perplexed. Anyway, so they had a son named Alistair, and similar to some other texts we'll be encountering in this series, The Wind in the Willows began as a series of nightly bedtime stories that Kenneth Grahme told his son. So that is sweet. There's a section in here on the illustrators of The Wind in the Willows, and some other stuff that I've read regarding the production of the film has suggested that the Arthur Rackham illustrations in particular may have been like a large influence in the development of the look of some of the settings in the film. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. Arthur Rackham seems to have touched several of the texts that Disney would later develop into feature-length animations. He is probably best known for his Alice in Wonderland illustrations. He also illustrated Peter Pan and Kensington Gardens. And initially he turned down the opportunity to illustrate The Wind in the Willows. He was busy at the time, and it wasn't until 30 years later that he had a second chance to do so, and it was actually his final work. And another well-known set of illustrations for The Wind in the Willows is Ernest Shepard's. And Ernest Shepard was the illustrator for many of A.A. Milne's works, including Winnie the Pooh and The House on Pooh Corner. So his style directly influenced the development of Disney's Winnie the Pooh characters and seems to have had an influence on their Wind in the Willows as well. Speaking of A.A. Milne, before he became a beloved children's book author, he was a playwright, and he actually dramatized The Wind in the Willows in 1921. He wrote the stage play Toad of Toad Hall. And when Disney decided they were going to produce an animated version of The Wind in the Willows, they bought the rights to both the book, The Wind in the Willows, and the play, Toad of Toad Hall. And you can kind of see that influence because the animation we end up with is The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Mr. Toad being the focus of the animation more so than he is in this book. He thought his happiness was complete when, as he meandered aimlessly along, suddenly he stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before, this sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh, to fling itself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. All was a shake and a shiver, glints and gleams and sparkles, rustle and swirl, chatter and bubble. The mole was bewitched, entranced, fascinated. By the side of the river he trotted as one trots when very small, by the side of a man who holds one spellbound by exciting stories. And when tired at last, he sat on the bank, while the river still chattered on to him, a babbling procession of the best stories of the world, sent from the heart of the earth to be told at last to the insatiable sea. That is what I like about this book. I love the way that it describes nature and just the joy of being like present. However, I wouldn't say that that is what gets translated onto the screen in the Disney adaptation. They weren't messing around when they called this the annotated edition. There's a lot of annotations and they are all long. This is taking me a lot longer to read than I expected. It's only 12 chapters. So, Ratty and Mole have gone to visit their friend Badger. They got a little bit lost in the woods along the way because it started to snow. And they're not there to talk about Toad, which I do believe is different from the movie, but they do end up telling him about Toad's motor cars, plural. He's had apparently 7 cars that he's crashed, and there's a pile of motor car parts as tall as the roof of his coach house, and he's been in the hospital 3 times and had to pay fines. So Mole says, Toad's rich, we all know, but he's not a millionaire, and he's a hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of law and order. Killed or ruined, it's got to be one of the 2 things, sooner or later. Badger, we're his friends, ought we to do something? The Badger went through a bit of hard thinking. Now look here, he said at last, rather severely. Of course you know I can't do anything now. His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. Then he says once the weather has turned, he'll do something. We'll take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back by reason, by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. Alright, we finally made it to the most significant chapter in regards to this adaptation. Chapter 6, Mr. Toad. Oh, big time jump here, wow. The previous chapters take place around Christmas, and then we jump straight to the early part of summer, I suppose, when Badger is prepared to help them out with Toad. The hour has come, said the Badger at last with great solemnity. What hour? Asked the Rat uneasily, glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece. Whose hour, you should rather say, replied the Badger. Why, Toad's hour, the hour of Toad. I said I would take him in hand as soon as the winter was well over, and I'm going to take him in hand today. So talking to him didn't work. So now they've decided to move into his house to keep an eye on him, and they're taking turns sleeping in his room, apparently. Oh, my goodness. What an intervention. Rat left him alone. Alright, I see. I was wondering why he gets thrown in jail. I couldn't remember. He straight up stole a car. He's not just crashing his car anymore. Hello. We're gonna try and finish this book tonight. It's throwing me off my timeline. So I'm on the chapter Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is a really interesting chapter in the book that is completely excluded from the world of the film, where Ratty and Mole actually encounter the Greek god Pan. Size continues to be something of a question. It's highlighted in the annotations as an issue for the illustrators. I'm a little bit confused about how big this boat is, because it fits a rat, a mole, and a baby otter. But it's small enough for a rat and a mole to man by themselves. just must have also been something that the Disney team had to confront. All right, we're back to Toad's adventures. This is the bit that's relevant. He's in prison. How is he gonna escape? Similar to the size thing, Toad is now interacting with humans. He stole a motor car, was taken to court, sent to jail. And the jailer and his daughter are human. She has a particular fondness for animals, so she says to her father, "Father, I can't bear to see that poor beast so unhappy, and getting so thin. You let me have the managing of him. You know how fond of animals I am. I'll make him eat from my hand, and sit up and do all sorts of things." Is he a pet, or is he a criminal in need of jailing? If you think too hard about the world building, it starts to maybe fall apart a little bit. The jailer's daughter is not in the Disney adaptation, but it's not to simplify the confusion that I'm experiencing, because there are still human characters in the film. So, look what I found. It's Little Toot. It's the original illustrations. It's taken me so long to finish reading The Wind in the Willows that the person who had this turned it in and I finally got my hands on it. Oh, yes. Yes, this is much better and much longer than the version that I read. Probably has much more in common with the Disney version. Look at him, he's so cute. I'm sorry. Little Toot's called Little Toot because it's the only noise he can make. Why are his dad and his grandfather Big Toot and Grandfather Toot? I'm so happy. Yay. Okay, so unlike in the Disney adaptation, he wasn't banished. He was just ostracized. That's better, right? SOS. I know I keep saying it, but I'm gonna finish this book today. The Further Adventures of Toad. He muttered under his breath words that should never pass the lips of either washerwoman or toads. Oh, why do you keep stealing people's conveyances? Down with the desperate and dangerous Toad. I did it! I did it! I finished this book. Okay, I have one more thing to read. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Alright, so this short story by Washington Irving was published in 1820 as part of a collection of 34 essays and short stories called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Ghent. It is presented here alongside another of his short stories, Rip Van Winkle. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. Don't ask me how long it's been. The answer is embarrassing. Oh, wait, there's a postscript. I did it. All right. I really only had to read for 12 more minutes last time. That's crazy. Okay. Last time I was lagging. I guess the back half of that story is the more interesting half. That means it's time for us to watch The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Let's go. Okay. It's time for us to go on a journey to nowhere in particular. Alright, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, released in 1949. It took 8 years to assemble and produce. So according to Robert Newman in his article, Disney's final package film, The Making and Marketing of the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was conceived in 1946 not as a mate to Toad, but as one of a handful of cartoon versions of American folktales to be used as segments in as yet untitled package pictures. Newman also explains how the production team went about making these two very different stories sort of vibe together a little better. As a unifying device and in order to boost their appeal to moviegoers, two entertainment personalities came on board as narrators, heard but not seen in the confines of a library briefly filmed in live action. Basil Rathbone for Toad and Bing Crosby for Ichabod. Each defends his national literary tradition, British or American, in arguing for which has produced the most, quote, fabulous character. If you were asked to choose the most fabulous character in English literature, who would it be? Robin Hood? King Arthur? Oliver Twist, perhaps? Great suggestions. I feel like you should make all those movies maybe in the future. Oh, we're merrily, 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 merrily on our way to nowhere in particular.
My lord, gentlemen.
I forgot that he defends himself in court. In the book, the car, Toad's obsession and mania with the automobile, represents his sort of distance from the other animals, his sort of proximity to humanity, like wanting to cross over into that world.
Got out of that lovely red car.
In this version, the motor car belongs to the weasels, who in the books represent like the wildest of wild animals. Also, in the book, the weasels just sort of take over Toad Hall because Toad's been gone for so long. In this, he trades the deed for Toad Hall. So, also different. May he get time off for good behavior. And it just cuts to Toad standing in the doorway, having just broken out of jail.
Toad! What are you doing here?
This version of Toad was innocent all along, though, which is a pretty blatant mischaracterization.
Come! I'll show you the world! Travel! Change! Excitement!
Brown Bones walked so Gaston could run.
Odds bodkins, gadzooks.
I made that joke, but genuinely, the Ichabod Crane song, he's walking with his nose in a book.
Who's that coming down the street?
Did Ichabod Crane walk so that Belle could run? You know what's really funny is that I was reading this part that I'm watching right now of the story and thinking, this is really unmemorable. They must not have adapted it. They did. It's just also unmemorable. Get to the Headless Horseman song, man. That's all I care about. When the spooks have a midnight jamboree, they break it out with fiendish glee. Ghosts are bad, but the one that's cursed is the Headless Horseman. He's the worst. With a hey, hey, and a clippity clop. He's out looking for a top to drop. I love this song. And I learned an interesting fact. Pause this. In the Newman article, my favorite Disney Halloween song was also commissioned for this movie. It's called Trick or Treat, and it ended up being used in a 1952 Donald Duck short. But it was initially supposed to be earlier in this sequence in Ichabod during the Halloween party. I assume while all of that dancing was going on, maybe? I just think it's really funny that my favorite two Disney Halloween songs were developed as part of the same project, even if they didn't actually end up going into the same film together.
Once inside the murky glen, Ichabod's anxiety increased 100-fold.
Was this a great idea to watch this kind of spooky movie the first night that I'm completely alone in this apartment? Oh God. Ugh. He just run his horse through a cobweb. Can't imagine a worse thing.
He's out looking for a head to swap.
How charming. I actually really liked that one. This brings us to the end of the wartime era, and what an era it was. We read such a ridiculously wide variety of texts for these films, from poems to picture books to Pecos bills to just plucking all of the most interesting bits of The Wind in the Willows, or rather, all the most toadiest bits of The Wind in the Willows. I do think that Piper at the Gates of Dawn is the most interesting bit of The Wind in the Willows. And I actually would have loved to see Disney's take on that like lovely pastoralism that's in the book that really does not make it onto the screen, but seems really in line with past projects like Fantasia and Bambi. Like if they had actually turned The Wind in the Willows into a full-length feature, maybe we would have gotten more of that, but oh well, choices were made decades ago. So in Newman's article that I have been referencing, he suggests that The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is a foreshadowing of the direction that Disney was about to take. In the next era, we'll be exploring the Silver Age. Although it is still a package film, technically, we're definitely moving away from our Make Mine Marries Our Fun and Fancy Freeze. We are firmly telling full stories. Like each of these, if you just added a little bit more, it could have been its own feature. You have the return to the storybook opening, a nod to Snow White and the earliest era of feature-length animation for the studio, but also a hint at what is to come with our next feature, Cinderella. And of course we have The Wind in the Willows as chosen source material for this adaptation, which comes from the same golden age of Edwardian British children's literature as Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, two of the most iconic Disney adaptations that we also have coming up. So all of these details combine into, yes, a sign pointing toward what we are about to see from the studio. So make sure you click that subscribe button so that you don't miss a thing. With that being said, my name is Miss Evalyn. I've had so much fun being your almost librarian today, and I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.